The dust hung thick in the little church of Bitter Creek, catching the afternoon light that slanted through narrow windows in bars of pale gold. The congregation rose from the wooden pews with a chorus of creaks and sighs, turning their faces toward the altar, where Catherine Celine stood in a dress that had belonged to someone else's dreams. The fabric was plain white cotton, yellowed at the seams, and it smelled faintly of camphor and the disappointment of previous hopes. Kate was 23 years old, and she had traveled $3,000 length to stand beside a man whose letters had promised kindness and partnership. But as she stood there, her hands trembling inside cotton gloves she had sewn during the long voyage from England, a cold certainty settled in her chest like a stone dropped into deep water. This was wrong. Everything about this moment was profoundly, irrevocably wrong. Franklin Marrero stood to her right, his shoulders square in a dark wool suit that smelled of tobacco and something sharper, ambition perhaps, or cruelty. Around town, they called him Blue Eyes, though Kate had learned in her 3 days here that those eyes held no warmth, only the cold calculation of a man assessing livestock for market value. The dread had been building since she arrived. It started as unease when Franklin's grip at the stagecoach had been too tight, too possessive. It grew when she saw his ranch, not the prosperous spread his letters described, but a rough collection of weathered buildings surrounded by thin cattle and hard-eyed men who watched her like wolves assessing prey. It crystallized into terror 2 nights ago when she overheard a conversation she was never meant to hear. She had been mending Franklin's shirt near the kitchen door, her needle moving through fabric in the mechanical rhythm of women's work when voices drifted from the next room. Franklin's smooth baritone, Sheriff Christian Doyle's rough laugh, and a third voice, educated, cultured, belonging to Bartholomew Locke, the mine owner. Bringing more girls after the election, Franklin had said casually, as if discussing cattle shipments. Contracts, debts worked off in the copper camps. As long as Harper keeps the ledgers clean, no one asks questions about transfers. Harper's a fool, but useful. Locke had replied, his voice smooth as oil on water. He records what we tell him to record. The beauty of it is, the marriages make it all legal. A man has rights over his wife's labor, especially when she owes him for passage and expenses. Christian's harsh laugh had made Kate's blood run cold. And if anyone complains, they find themselves in my jail. Amazing what problems a good cell solves, or a convenient accident. The needle had slipped, pricking Kate's finger. Blood welled bright red against pale skin. She had looked at the door to the yard, calculating distances, considering flight. But where would she go? She had no money, no horse, no knowledge of this harsh landscape. She was alone in a country that felt as foreign as the moon, surrounded by men who saw her as a commodity to be bought and sold. So she had stayed. She had stitched. She had listened to her heart pound and told herself there must be some misunderstanding, some explanation that would make the words mean something other than what they clearly meant. But now, standing at the altar in a borrowed dress that smelled of other women's failures, Kate knew the truth with absolute clarity. She was not a bride. She was merchandise. The marriage was just the legal mechanism to make trafficking women appear respectable. The preacher, Reverend Abner Colt, was a thin man with watery eyes and a voice that wavered like candle flame in wind. He cleared his throat and opened the worn Bible, its leather cover cracked and faded. We are gathered here in the sight of heaven and this community to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. He began, the words rushing together, as if he wanted to finish quickly and be done with whatever weight his conscience carried. Kate's stomach twisted. She had rehearsed this moment during the long voyage, told herself marriage was a practical arrangement, that affection could grow between people who treated each other with basic decency. But Franklin had no intention of treating her with anything except the callous efficiency of a man managing property. The conversation she had overheard made that abundantly clear. Marriage is an honorable estate. Reverend Colt continued, not meeting anyone's eyes. Instituted by God in paradise, signifying the mystical union between Christ and his church. The irony was bitter on Kate's tongue. There was nothing honorable about this transaction, nothing mystical, except perhaps the magic trick of making slavery look respectable by wrapping it in wedding vows. If any person can show just 'cause why these two should not be joined in matrimony, let them speak now or forever. Hold their peace, the Reverend intoned. The words felt like a challenge thrown into a room where everyone knew the answer, but no one dared speak it. The silence stretched. Kate felt it pressing against her eardrums like water at depth. She opened her mouth, her own objection rising in her throat like bile. But what good would it do? Franklin had paid for her passage. The law saw her as his responsibility, his property in all but name. If she refused, where would that leave her? Stranded in a hostile town with no resources and no allies, at the mercy of men who had already demonstrated exactly how much mercy they possessed. The moment passed. No one spoke. The Reverend's shoulders seemed to sag with relief. Frank Maroro, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do. Franklin's voice was firm, satisfied, the voice of a man closing a profitable deal. Reverend Colt turned to Kate. His eyes, when they finally met hers, held something that might have been pity or might have been guilt. Catherine Celine, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to honor and obey him until death do you part? The word obey stuck in Kate's throat like a burr. Her mind screamed at her to run, to refuse to do anything except surrender herself to this fate. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. The silence stretched 1 second to 3. The congregation shifted uncomfortably in their pews. Someone coughed. A baby whimpered and was quickly shushed. Franklin's hand closed around her upper arm, fingers digging into flesh, hard enough that Kate knew there would be bruises. You'll say what I paid for. He hissed, his voice venomous, and meant only for her ears, his breath hot against her cheek. Kate jerked her arm away, the movement instinctive, driven by a lifetime of being told she had the right to refuse unwanted touch. For a moment, she saw surprise flicker across Franklin's face, as if a horse had suddenly spoken. Then surprise transformed into pure rage, his face flushing, red eyes narrowing to slits. The slap came so fast, Kate barely registered the movement. His palm cracked across her cheek with a sound like a gunshot. The force of it spun her sideways, and she stumbled, catching herself on the altar rail. Her glove tore on rough wood, and blood welled from her ring finger where it scraped against a nail head. The taste of copper filled her mouth. She had bitten her tongue. The church went utterly still. No one moved, no one spoke. Kate lifted her head slowly, tasting blood, her cheek burning, and saw rows of faces staring. Shocked, perhaps uncomfortable, certainly, but not surprised, not outraged. This was Bitter Creek, Montana territory, where women were scarce and men did as they pleased. This was a place where the law was whatever Sheriff Christian Doyle said it was, and Christian was Franklin's friend. Kate understood in that moment of perfect clarity that no one in this room would help her. They would watch her be bound to a man who had just struck her in a church, in front of witnesses, in the middle of a sacred ceremony. And they would do nothing. They would go home and eat their Sunday dinners and tell themselves it was not their business, that marriage was between a man and his wife, that surely she must have done something to provoke him. The despair was absolute, crushing. Kate felt it settling over her like grave dirt. Then the rear doors slammed open with a bang that echoed like thunder. Harsh daylight poured into the dim room, slicing through dust motes like blades. A tall figure filled the doorway, silhouetted against the bright sky. For a moment, Kate could not make out his features, only the shape, broad shoulders, purposeful stance, the outline of something powerful and deliberate in every line of his body. He stepped inside and the light shifted. Kate saw him clearly, a Lakota warrior, his black hair braided and wrapped with otter fur, a single eagle feather tied behind his right ear. He wore a bone breastplate over a beaded buckskin shirt, and on a wide leather belt he carried both a knife and a Colt revolver. His moccasins whispered on the wooden floor as he walked, a sound like wind through grass. His eyes dark and steady as deep water swept the scene with the efficiency of a man trained to assess danger quickly. Kate's bloody cheek, Franklin's raised hand, still curled from the blow. The frozen preacher, the congregation pressed back against the pews like prey animals sensing a predator. The warrior walked straight down the center aisle. Franklin half turned his hand, dropping toward the pistol at his hip, but something in the warrior's expression made him pause. The warrior stopped 3 paces away. When he spoke, his voice was calm and flat, carrying to the back pews with absolute certainty. His English was precise, touched with an accent that suggested it was learned rather than native, but perfectly clear. "Touch her again." Not a question, not even a threat. A promise delivered with the kind of certainty that made threats unnecessary. For a heartbeat that stretched like eternity, everyone in the church froze. Then Franklin lunged for his gun, and the church erupted into chaos. 3 days earlier, Kate had stepped down from the stagecoach with an aching back and a single carpet bag containing everything she owned. The journey from New York had taken 2 weeks, railed to Chicago, railed to Omaha, then stagecoach through endless prairie that made her feel small and lost in a way the ocean voyage never had. At least the ocean had boundaries, visible horizons. This land seemed to go on forever, swallowing travelers whole. Bitter Creek was a hard town scratched into Montana territory, like a wound that refused to heal. A saloon with peeling paint and broken shutters, a telegraph office that doubled as the post station, a livery stable that smelled of manure and rot, a general store with dusty windows, and the new church, its bell tower still gleaming with fresh paint and smelling of pine, the one spot of hope in a landscape of worn disappointment. The driver, a grizzled man named Horace, with tobacco-stained teeth and shrewd eyes, handed down her bag. "Good luck, miss," he said. And something in his tone, pity, perhaps, or resignation, made Kate's stomach clench. She had read Franklin Maroro's letters until the paper went soft at the creases. The first letter had arrived 3 months after her father's death, forwarded by the church that ran the marriage bureau. A kind widower with land and respect, it said, looking for a partner to build a future in a growing territory. The words had promised safety, which was all Kate wanted after her father's death, left her penniless in a country that had no use for educated women with no family connections. The man waiting beside the stagecoach wore polished boots and a wide-brimmed hat. He removed it as Kate approached, revealing sandy hair and sharp features. His pale blue eyes assessed her with the efficiency of a horse trader, judging a mare teeth build likely breeding capacity. "Miss Celine," he said smoothly. "Welcome to Bitter Creek. I'm Franklin Maroro." He offered his hand. Kate took it, and his grip was crushing, held too long, his thumb pressing against the pulse point at her wrist, as if measuring her heartbeat. Up close, she could see the coldness in those blue eyes, the tight line of his mouth that suggested cruelty held in check only by social convention. "Thank you, Mr. Maroro," she managed, withdrawing her hand as soon as politeness allowed. "Frank," he corrected his smile, not reaching his eyes. We'll be married in 3 days. I've arranged everything. The dress is ready. The preacher is prepared. The ceremony will be simple. No need for fuss. 3 days. Kate had expected at least a week, some time to know him, to verify that the promises in his letters bore any resemblance to reality. But looking at his expression, expectant proprietary, she understood this was not a negotiation. This was an announcement. He led her to a wagon with splintered seats and dark stains that might have been blood or might have been rust. They rattled out of town on a rutted road that followed Bitter Creek River. The landscape was harsh but beautiful in its way. Rolling prairie giving way to hills, cottonwoods marking the river's course, mountains visible in the distance, like promises or threats depending on your disposition. Near a bend in the river, Kate saw a Lakota camp. 6 tepees among the cottonwood smoke rising from cook fires, children splashing in the shallows, women working hides while men tended horses. It looked peaceful, orderly, a community functioning according to its own rhythms. Franklin spat over the side of the wagon. Lakota camp. They're supposed to stay on the reservation, but Sheriff Doyle turns a blind eye. Easier than dealing with complaints from the Indian agent. Besides, they trade sometimes, and they stay out of town mostly. Still, it's irritating having them so close. The contempt in his voice was casual, reflexive, the disdain of a man who had never questioned his right to view other human beings as lesser. Kate said nothing, but she filed the observation away. In the growing catalog of red flags, her instincts were compiling. The wagon wheel hit a deep rut and sank to the hub. Franklin cursed and climbed down, kicking the wheel uselessly, as if violence would solve the problem. Kate remained in her seat, hands folded, watching 2 men approach from the Lakota camp. The first moved with quiet grace that reminded Kate of the big cats she had seen in London's zoological gardens. Economical motion that wasted no energy every step, placed with awareness. He was perhaps 30 years old with strong features and eyes that seemed to see everything. Assess everything. Judge everything with careful precision. His black hair was braided and wrapped with otter fur, and he wore a bone breastplate over buckskin that was decorated with intricate beadwork. The second man had similar features, but a harder mouth anger in the set of his shoulders, suspicion in his eyes. His hair was also braided, but he wore no ornaments except a single feather. The resemblance between them suggested brothers, but the distance in their body language suggested something broken between them that had never properly healed. They spoke briefly in Lakota, a language Kate did not understand, but whose rhythms she found oddly musical, before ducking under the wagon and putting their shoulders to the wheel. The first man, the one who moved like a cat, caught Kate's eye through the window and gave the faintest nod of acknowledgement, seeing her as a person rather than part of the wagon's cargo. The gesture, small as it was, felt like a gift. "We share the water," the first man said in careful English to his companion as they heaved. "If the river floods, it drowns both camps." The wagon lurched free. Franklin climbed back to his seat without a word of thanks and snapped the reins, the horses jerking forward. Kate turned to look back, raising her hand to the glass in gratitude. The first warrior she would learn later, his name was Dakota, which meant friend, gave another small nod before stepping back, his brother already turning away. "Savages ought to stay on their own side," Franklin muttered, guiding the horses back to the road. "Give them an inch, they'll take a mile. That's their nature." Kate said nothing, but she remembered the careful way the 2 men had worked together, despite whatever tension existed between them, and the efficiency of their help, the dignity in their bearing. They had seemed far more civilized than the man beside her, who dismissed them as savages. Franklin's ranch was not the prosperous spread his letters had described. The main house was weathered paint, peeling porch sagging. The barn needed repairs. She could see daylight through gaps in the boards. The fences were rough, many posts leaning. The cattle she glimpsed were thin, too thin for animals supposedly thriving on good grazing land. And the men there were 5 or 6 loitering near the bunkhouse, watched her with expressions that made her skin crawl, a predatory assessment that had nothing to do with admiration and everything to do with ownership. In the kitchen, she met Meline, another immigrant, a French woman with dark hair and exhausted eyes, and a faded bruise on her throat that makeup had failed to fully conceal. "You are the new bride," Meline said in French-accented English, her voice flat. "Yes, Catherine Celine Kate, Meline Archambault." She hesitated, glancing toward the door where Franklin's boots could be heard on the porch, then very quietly, "Be careful. Do what he says. Don't ask questions. Don't talk back. Don't give him any reason. Just be careful." The words were a warning and a surrender. The advice of someone who had learned to survive by making herself small and quiet and obedient. Kate wanted to ask questions. "What happened to you? How did you end up here? Is there any way out?" But Franklin's shadow filled the doorway, and Meline turned away quickly, returning to her work at the stove. That night, Kate lay in a small room that smelled of dust and mouse droppings, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle. She had unpacked her carpet bag, 2 dresses, undergarments, her mother's Bible, her father's pocket watch, and a small bundle of letters tied with ribbon tokens of a life that felt impossibly distant now. She was mending Franklin's shirt near the thin-paned window when voices drifted from the next room. She had not meant to eavesdrop. The walls were simply too thin to prevent it. "Bringing more girls after the election." Franklin's voice casual and businesslike. "Contracts debts worked off in the copper camps. As long as Harper keeps the ledgers clean, no one asks questions about transfers." Kate's needle paused mid-stitch. "Harper's a fool but useful." Another voice, educated and smooth. "Bartholomew Lockett." She would learn later, the mine owner who controlled most of the copper operations in the territory. "He records what we tell him to record. And the beauty of it is, the marriages make it all legal. A man has rights over his wife's labor, especially when she owes him for passage and expenses. On paper, it's all perfectly legitimate." A third voice, rough and amused, Sheriff Christian Doyle. "And if anyone complains, they find themselves in my jail. Amazing what problems a good cell solves. Or a convenient accident on a lonely road. Territory is a dangerous place, laughter casual and comfortable. The laughter of men who had done terrible things and expected to keep doing them without consequence." Kate's needle slipped, pricking her finger. Blood welled bright and red. She looked at the door that led to the yard, calculating distances. Her horse-riding experience was limited to a few lessons as a girl. She had perhaps $20 in coins sewn into her corset. The nearest town of any size was, 50 mim or 100, and she had no map, no weapon, no knowledge of this country. She stayed. She stitched. She listened to her heart pound and told herself there must be some way out, some solution she was not seeing yet in her fear and exhaustion. The next day, Kate walked to the general store with Meline. The heat pressed down despite the early hour, and dust devils danced in the street. They passed the saloon where rough men lounged on the porch, watching them with expressions that made Kate feel naked despite being fully clothed from collar to ankle. Inside the store, Kate met Celine Morrow, the schoolteacher. She was a French woman in her 30s, with dark hair pulled back severely and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She was examining bolts of fabric when Kate and Meline entered. "You must be Miss Celine," the schoolteacher said, straightening. "The bride? I am Celine Morrow. I teach the children here, such children as their parents permit to attend. Pleased to meet you, Kate said, grateful for a friendly face. Celine glanced at the shop owner who was helping another customer, then lowered her voice. May I offer advice? Don't trust the men here. Don't trust the law. Sheriff Doyle is more bandit than lawman. I teach children from both communities, white and Lakota. I see things. Girls who vanish, women who arrive and are never seen again. Franklin Maroro is not what his letters promised. Kate's throat tightened. I have nowhere else to go. Celine's expression softened. Then be very careful. And if you need help, if you need a place to go, someone to speak for you, come to the schoolhouse. It's the white building with blue shutters at the edge of town. I won't turn you away. The kindness was unexpected, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Kate nodded, not trusting her voice. In another part of Bitter Creek, Dr. Edwin Harper ran a small clinic from a converted house on the edge of town. He was a slight man in his 40s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers, more comfortable with books than people, but conscientious in his care. Edwin noticed things others missed or chose not to see. Over the past year, a pattern had emerged that troubled his methodical mind. Mail-order brides arriving in town full of hope, or at least resignation, then vanishing within weeks. Marriage certificates filed at the courthouse. Women transferred to Copper Canyon or other mining camps, supposedly to work or join their husbands. Death certificates signed by Sheriff Christian without benefit of autopsy, causes listed as fever or accident or childbirth gone wrong. But Edwin had examined 3 of these supposedly dead women before their deaths, and none had shown signs of illness. One had been healthy enough to walk from the general store to the church 2 days before she supposedly died of fever. Another had been young and strong, with no history of medical problems. Yet she supposedly fell down a well and drowned, except the well in question was barely 40 deep. Edwin kept meticulous notes in a private ledger. Names, dates, discrepancies, questions that had no satisfactory answers. But he was one man in a rough town, and Christian was the law. Edwin did not know how to expose what he suspected without becoming a target himself. One evening, locking the clinic door as dusk painted the sky purple and gold, Edwin saw a Lakota warrior standing near the hitching post, holding a paint horse's res. The warrior stood patiently, not intruding, but clearly waiting. "Doctor," the warrior said carefully as Edwin turned. "Long Shadow." Edwin had treated the warrior's brother once, after a vicious fight with a mind foreman, stitching a deep knife wound that would have killed the man if infection had set in. Since then, a wary respect existed between the doctor and the Lakota camp. Edwin did not cheat them on prices or refuse them treatment. They paid fairly and did not cause trouble. "I need to speak with you." Dakota said, his English precise, if accented about the women who vanish. They spoke in shadows behind the clinic voices low. Dakota told him about Ayanna, his niece, 14 years old, bright and curious, who had gone to town 6 weeks ago to sell beadwork and never returned. Christian says she left willingly to work at a boarding house in Copper Canyon. Dakota said, and Edwin could hear the controlled fury beneath the calm words. He says she signed papers, but Ayanna does not write English well enough to sign papers, and she would never leave without telling her mother. Edwin thought of his ledger, the pattern of vanishings. "A girl was brought to the clinic 2 weeks ago," he said slowly. "Young Lakota bruises on her wrists like from rope. Christian said she had fever, was being transported to the boarding house in Copper Canyon for treatment. But she had no fever. Her pulse was strong. She just looked terrified. I tried to speak with her, but Christian rushed her out before I could examine her properly." Ayanna Dakota said the name both prayer and curse. "I don't know where they took her after that," Edwin admitted. "But there's a pattern. Women come, mail order, brides, Lakota girls, immigrant women looking for work. They vanish. The constants are Christian Locke and Franklin Maroro. I think they're selling them, trafficking them to the mines where workers are scarce and questions are few. But I can't prove it. Not enough to bring charges. Dakota's expression went very still. The stillness of a predator deciding whether to strike now or wait. Then we find proof. We bring them back, all of them. Edwin hesitated. He was a doctor, not a fighter. But he thought of the women in his ledger, the discrepancies. Christian dismissed the death certificates he signed, knowing they were likely lies. We'll need documents, witnesses, something undeniable, something that even a corrupt sheriff can't explain away. Dakota nodded slowly. Then we get those things, whatever it takes. The chaos in the church was immediate and terrifying. Franklin lunged for his pistol, but Dakota moved first with the speed of someone trained from childhood in combat. He clamped Franklin's wrist in an iron grip, twisted, and slammed his gun hand into the corner of a pew. Wood splintered with a crack like breaking bone. The pistol clattered across the floor, spinning under a bench. Women screamed. Men scrambled for cover, diving behind pews or pressing against walls. Someone knocked over a candelabra, and hot wax splattered across the floor. Sheriff Christian Doyle shoved through the crowd, revolver already drawn, his face flushed with anger and something like excitement. "Drop it in. That's assault. That's attacking a white man in a church." "He struck the woman," Dakota said calmly, not releasing Franklin's wrist, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "I saw him. You all saw him." Christian didn't lower his weapon. Two deputies pushed forward, hands on their guns. The crowd pressed back, giving them room. No one willing to intervene or take a stand. Franklin spat blood from a split lip. "He barged in to steal my bride. He's trying to kidnap a white woman." "Hang him." The accusation was calculated to inflame. And it worked. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. In the Montana Territory of 1873, the accusation of a Lakota warrior attempting to kidnap a white woman was as good as a death sentence. The preacher stammered uselessly, wringing his hands, looking anywhere but at the violence unfolding before his altar. From a side pew, Selene Morrow stood, her voice cutting clear and sharp. "Sheriff, you'd hang a man for stopping a beating, for protecting a woman from assault." Christian swung his gun barrel toward her. "Don't start school, teacher. This ain't your concern. It's everyone's concern." Selene shot back, but her voice wavered slightly, fear breaking through courage. In the back corner, Dr. Edwin Harper had reached a decision. He kicked open a side door that led toward the livery stable. Afternoon sunlight spilling in. "Dakota, this way." Dakota glanced once at Kate. Their eyes met across the chaos, hers frightened but furious, his steady and dark as deep water. A moment of connection, strangers recognizing something in each other that transcended circumstance. When Christian lunged with shackles, Dakota shoved a deputy hard into the pews, sending him sprawling, grabbed Kate's wrist, and bolted toward the doors Edwin held open. Gunshots cracked deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. A bullet punched a hole beside the wooden cross splinters, exploding. Another blew out a window glass, raining down in bright shards. Dakota shoved Kate ahead of him, shielding her with his body splinters, stinging their shoulders and arms. Outside, they sprinted across the dusty yard. A bullet hit the horse rope, water spraying. Dakota threw Kate onto a bay geeling tethered near the livery, swung up behind her and spurred hard. The horse leapt forward, nearly unseating them both, then found its stride. They exploded from town at full gallop, chased by shouts and gunfire and the chaos of a posse forming two strangers suddenly bound by what everyone else would call a crime. Sheriff Christian scraped together a posse with terrifying efficiency. 8 riders, including Franklin, whose face was a mask of rage blood still on his chin from his split lip. They thundered after Dakota and Kate across open prairie where there was no cover, no place to hide, only speed and distance between hunter and prey. Kate clung to the saddle horn, her borrowed wedding dress tangling around her legs, the veil she had never removed, whipping in the wind. Dakota rode behind her, one arm around her waist to keep her steady, his body shielding her from bullets. Shots cracked across the prairie. Sharp sounds, followed by the whistle of bullets passing close enough to feel. Dirt leapt near the horse's hooves. A bullet creased the saddle, and the horse screamed and surged forward, panic lending its speed. Ahead, cottonwoods marked the river. The bank dropped steep to fast-moving water, swollen with mountain snowmelt. Dakota pulled the horse to a plunging stop at the edge. "We cross here," he said, breathing hard. Kate looked at the water, the current strong enough to make the surface roil. "The current will be swept away." Another bullet winded past, close enough that Kate felt the displacement of air. The posse was closing perhaps a 4-mile back and coming fast. Dakota urged the horse down the bank. The animal balked, planting its feet, but another gunshot convinced it. They plunged into the creek. The water hit like ice despite the season shocking the breath from Kate's lungs. It shoved at their legs, then their waists, the bottom dropping away. Kate went underdress, dragging her down like an anchor cotton, soaking up water and pulling her toward the rocky bottom. She clawed at the fabric panic, surging her lungs burning. Then a hand clamped her arm, jerking her up. Dakota dragged her through waist-deep water, both of them slamming against rocks, bruising ribs and shins. The horse struggled beside them, eyes rolling white with fear. Somehow they made it across, scrambling up the far bank on hands and knees, soaked in shaking and gasping. Behind them, the posse reached the near bank. Horses bulked at the steep drop and swift water. Christian stood in his stirrups, face purple with rage. "We'll catch them at the ford," he shouted voice, carrying across the water. "They're on foot now, won't make it far." Dakota led Kate into the cottonwoods at a stumbling run toward the Lakota camp. Kate's dress was impossibly heavy, water squatching in her boots. But she pushed forward on adrenaline and terror and something else. A fierce determination not to surrender to the fate Franklin had planned for her. The Lakota camp was 6 teepees arranged in a circle. Smoke rising from morning cook fires, hides stretched on racks for tanning. When Dakota and Kate emerged, dripping from the trees, the camp went utterly still. Children stopped playing. Women paused their work. Men reached for weapons, assessing the threat. An older woman with silver-streaked hair and a face carved by years and wisdom. Tala, the camp grandmother, set down her knife and rose from where she had been butchering a rabbit. She took in the scene with sharp eyes. Dakota soaked and bleeding from a cut on his arm, a white woman in a ruined wedding dress clinging to his hand. "Dakota," she said sharply in Lakota, "what have you done?" They spoke urgently in a language Kate did not understand, but she could read the emotions, Tala's concern, Dakota's grim determination, the worry in the faces of others gathering. Finally, Tala nodded, turning to give rapid instructions. A younger woman brought a blanket, wrapping it around Kate's shoulders with surprising gentleness. Someone else pressed a cup of hot broth into her hands. Kate sank by the fire, shaking, not just from cold, but from shock finally setting in. She had just fled her own wedding. She had been dragged into a river and nearly drowned. She was now in a Lakota camp, surrounded by people who had every reason to distrust her kind, with a posy of armed men hunting her. The reality of it crashed over her in waves. Tala knelt beside her, studying her face, the bruise blooming on her cheek from Franklin's slap, the terror and determination wearing in her eyes. After a moment, Tala said in accented but clear English, "You are safe here for now." An hour later, as clothes dried by the fire and Kate huddled in borrowed buckskin that was too large, Dr. Edwin Harper rode into camp on a mule, looking harried and frightened, but determined. He carried his medical bag and a leather satchel that he clutched protectively. "I took this from the clinic before Christian could lock me out," Edwin said breathlessly, setting the satchel on a flat rock and pulling out a dark leather ledger. "Every mail-order bride who came through Bitter Creek this year. Names assigned husbands, dates of marriage, dates of transfer. Look," he flipped pages. Kate leaned forward, heart pounding, and saw her own name. Catherine Celine arrived September 10th, married to Franklin Marrero. September 13th, scheduled transfer to Copper Canyon boarding house, October 15th. Beside her name was a notation, $75 bonus for obedience. She felt sick. Below her name were others. Malene Archambault, Anna Schmidt, Lucia Mendes, women whose faces she had glimpsed in town or heard whispered about. Beside many names were notations transferred. Debt outstanding, deceased, fever. "They're selling us," Kate said, her voice hollow. "Marrying us to create legal ownership, then selling us to the mines like cattle." Edwin nodded grimly. "Trafficking masked as legitimate marriage and labor contracts. The women owe money for passage wedding expenses, clothing debts that conveniently equal more than they can ever repay through work. So, they're permanently indentured. If they complain or resist, Christian arrests them, or they have accidents. If Christian wins the election next week, he'll control the law completely. No territorial marshal will investigate if the local sheriff vouches for everything being legal." Dakota looked from the ledger to Kate's bruised face, then toward the distant smoke of Copper Canyon rising from the hills. "Then we take the proof where Christian can't bury it. We go to the territorial authorities in Copper Canyon, and we bring Ayanna home." Tala placed a weathered hand on his arm. "The soldiers watch us. If we cause trouble, they'll use it as an excuse to force us off this land, push us farther onto the reservation where the soil is poor and the game is gone. If we do nothing, Ayanna dies," Dakota replied, voiced tight with controlled emotion. "And more girls follow Lakota and white both. This evil doesn't distinguish. It consumes everyone in its path." Tala closed her eyes, the weight of leadership and impossible choices visible in every line of her face. Then she nodded slowly. "Go do what must be done, but come back alive. Come back to tell us what was accomplished. The people need hope, not just more grief." The plan was desperate and dangerous. Reach Copper Canyon. Confront territorial authorities with the Ledger Demand investigation. Refuse to be silenced or dismissed. Along the way, find Ayanna and any other women still alive. Bring them home. Simple in outline, likely fatal in execution. Celine Morrow insisted on joining despite the danger. "I speak French-English and enough Lakota to manage. You need someone who can navigate bureaucracy, who knows how to talk to officials and make them listen. Besides, I won't sit idle while girls vanish. I teach them to read and write and dream of futures. I owe them more than silence." Tala gave them supplies, dried meat, journey cakes, water skins, blankets, a rifle for Kate, and ammunition for Dakota, and a warning. "Christian will ride hard to catch you. He has everything to lose if this becomes public. He'll kill all of you to protect himself and Locke. Don't give him the chance." They traveled by night through rolling prairie that seemed to go on forever, skirting ranches where dogs might bark and raise alarms. The stars were impossibly bright in the Milky Way, a river of light overhead. Kate had never seen such darkness, or such stars had never felt so small and exposed under such vast sky. The first night passed without incident. The second brought them near Franklin's ranch as dawn touched the horizon. They crouched in a dry wash, watching as a guarded wagon was loaded by lamplight near the barn. Kate recognized Malene being shoved toward it, wrists bound with rope, her face pale and resigned. Kate started to rise instinct, demanding action, but Dakota pressed her down with gentle firmness. 4 of us against 10 of them. We die here. No one stops the others. No one brings proof to the authorities. No one saves anyone. The logic was sound, but bitter. Kate watched helplessly as the wagon rumbled past their hiding place wheels, creaking. At the last moment, Celine slipped forward with remarkable stealth and pressed a small knife through the slats into Malene's bound hands. "If you get a chance," she whispered urgently in French, "cut the rope. Jump, run for the trees. We'll find you." Malene's eyes met Kate's through the slats. Terror and thin hope wearing there. Then the wagon was past, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness, and they could only watch and hope Malene would find courage and opportunity. The next day, crossing open range under a sky that had turned ominous and green-gray, a thunderstorm boiled up from the mountains with terrifying speed. Rain lashed down in sheets, visibility dropping to almost nothing. Then came a sound like continuous thunder, the ground trembling beneath them. Off the horses, Dakota shouted over the storm, "Stampede into the Ayoyo." A cattle stampede came boiling out of the rain. Hundreds of steers driven mad by lightning and thunder horns, clashing hooves pounding the earth hard enough to shake teeth. The 4 travelers dove into a narrow streambed, pressing against rock walls as the herd roared past. A stray steer, wild-eyed and foaming, slammed into Celine. Kate lunged without thinking, dragging the teacher flat as another wave of cattle thundered past, inches away, close enough to feel their body heat and smell their terror. Rocks showered down from the disturbed bank, one grazing Dakota's shoulder hard enough to draw blood. When the herd finally passed, they were bruised, gasping, soaked through and covered in mud, but alive. They lay in the streambed for long moments, hearts pounding, unable to quite believe they had survived. That night, camped in a shallow draw, with a carefully shielded fire barely large enough to heat coffee, they built a small sense of community from shared survival. Kate sat beside Dakota as clothes dried their shoulders, nearly touching. The others dozed fitfully, exhausted by fear and exertion. "Tell me about Ayanna," Kate said softly, wanting to put a human face to the name they were risking their lives for. Dakota stared into the flames, his strong profile shadowed and highlighted by firelight. "She's my brother's daughter, 14 years old. She laughs like water over stones, this bright bubbling sound that makes everyone around her smile. She wanted to learn English reading and writing. Thought if she knew the white man's words, she could speak for our people when soldiers came with papers we didn't understand. She was so certain that understanding would protect us." Kate's throat tightened with grief for a girl she had never met. "And your brother, Gamda?" Pain flickered across Dakota's face. "Gamda is angry. He sees our land taken piece by piece, treaties broken, our people pushed aside. Where I try to build bridges between our people and yours, he wants to burn those bridges, drive the whites out, or die trying. When Ayanna disappeared, he blamed me. Said if I hadn't taught her to trust white people to go into their towns and trade with them, she would be safe in camp. And he's not wrong. My choices led to her capture. Or Franklin and Christian's choices led to her capture," Kate said firmly. "You can't blame yourself for the evil other men do." Dakota looked at her directly, and in his eyes, Kate saw a depth of sadness and responsibility she was only beginning to understand. "Can't I? If I know the white men lie, if I know they break promises and treaties, if I know they see us as less than human, and I still tell a 14-year-old girl to trust them, whose fault is it when she's taken?" Kate had no easy answer. She thought of her own choices, trusting Franklin's letters, believing promises of partnership and respect, ignoring her instincts that screamed danger. "What if we fail?" she asked quietly. "What if we can't save her? Then we die trying to make things better." That's more than most can say. Most people see evil and look away, because it's safer, because it's easier. At least we looked it in the face. It was honest in a way that Kate found both terrifying and deeply attractive. Dakota wasn't offering her false comfort or easy promises. He was offering truth, and somehow that mattered more. Later, after the others slept, Dakota set up tin cans on a fallen log and handed Kate a revolver. It was heavy, cold, foreign in her hands. "I don't want to shoot anyone," Kate said. But she took the weapon. "Want and need are different things," Dakota replied patiently. "Franklin and Christian count on women being afraid, helpless. Every woman they take believes she has no power, no choices. I'll show you that you do. You may never need to fire this, but knowing you can changes how you move, how you think. It changes how they see you." He demonstrated proper grip, how to steady the barrel with both hands, how to breathe and squeeze the trigger rather than jerk it. His hands were warm when they adjusted her grip, careful and respectful, never lingering or presuming. He smelled of wood smoke and leather and something else, something clean and wild that Kate couldn't name. Her first shot went wide, the recoil shocking. The second clipped a can, sending it spinning. The third punched through with a satisfying ping that made Celine, pretending to sleep, clap softly. "Brava," the schoolteacher said. "You're no longer prey. You're something that bites back." Dakota gave a rare half-smile, and Kate felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "Make Franklin wrong about your fear," he said. "Make all of them wrong." Something shifted between them as their eyes met. Kate was no longer just someone he protected out of duty or compassion. She was becoming someone who could stand beside him, who could fight her own battles, even if she needed allies. The realization stirred something in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with recognition. Two people finding in each other a strength they hadn't known they possessed. As they rode deeper into the hills over the following days, the landscape changed. Red cliffs, rising like ancient fortresses, narrow canyons where water had carved stone into fantastic shapes, abandoned mine shafts that gaped like empty eye sockets in the hillsides. The beauty was harsh, unforgiving, but Kate found herself loving it in a way she had never loved England's tamed countryside. This land demanded you be strong. It made no apologies. One evening, watering the horses at a spring, Edwin spread his ledger again, studying entries by fading light. Every woman transferred had a debt listed: medical costs, travel expenses, wedding costs. The amounts are always calculated, so they can never pay them off. Anna Schmidt owed $300 for passage and her wedding dress. At 15 cents a day for laundry work, that's over 5 years of labor if she never ate or needed clothing or got sick. It's designed to trap them permanently. "Indentured servitude," Celine said bitterly. "Slavery dressed up in legal language. And because the women are married because they owe money, it all appears legitimate on paper." Kate thought of Franklin's careful letters and the promises of partnership and respect. All lies calculated to lure desperate women into a trap. How many total? How many women? Edwin's face was bleak in the dying light. "At least 20 in Bitter Creek alone this year that I can document. Across the territory of Christian and Lockjack are doing this in multiple towns, coordinating with other corrupt sheriffs, and mine owners could be hundreds." The scale of it was staggering, sickening. Kate thought of all those women like her, hoping for something better, walking willingly into nightmare. Dakota stood at the stream's edge, staring toward Copper Canyon's distant smoke, rising above the hills like a smudge against the sky. "We end this," he said quietly, but with absolute certainty. No more girls in wagons, no more names and ledgers. We end this, or we die trying. On the fourth night, they reached Copper Canyon's outskirts. The mining town was larger than Bitter Creek, a sprawling bruise of smoke and noise in constant motion. Or carts rattled on tracks. Stamping mills pounded day and night. The air tasted of sulfur and copper and human misery. Men stumbled between saloons and gambling houses. Women in bright dresses called from doorways, their eyes hard and their smiles mechanical. At the telegraph office, Edwin requested Marshal Vernon Hale, a territorial officer rumored to be honest, one of the few lawmen not in Locke's pocket. They waited in a cramped hallway that smelled of tobacco and sweat, while voices murmured behind a closed door. When the door opened, Marshal Hale stepped out. He was tall with a graying beard and sharp eyes that had seen too much corruption and not enough justice. He had a bureaucratic flatness to his expression and the careful neutrality of a man who played his cards close. Beside him stood Bartholomew Lockhack, immaculate despite the dust and heat, dressed in an expensive suit that looked absurdly out of place in a mining town. He was perhaps 50 with silver at his temples, and the kind of educated Polish that made men underestimate how ruthless he could be. Locke's gaze flicked to Edwin's leather bag, then to Dakota's braids, then to Kate's bruised face, still visible despite days of healing. A predatory smile spread across his face, the smile of a man who had just recognized that his enemies had delivered themselves to his doorstep. "Dr. Harper," Locke said pleasantly, his voice smooth as oil. "You brought friends. And my ledger, I presume, the one that went missing from Bitter Creek." Before anyone could react, a large man appeared behind them. Trusty Tom. They called him ironic since he was loyal only to whoever paid most. Two riflemen stepped from side rooms. The hallway became a trap. Walls too close, too many guns, no way out. Marshal Hale already received a wire from Sheriff Doyle. Locke continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "He warned us about agitators spreading lies, interfering with legal contracts, trying to stir up trouble between the races. A Lakota warrior kidnapping a white bride from her own wedding, a doctor stealing private business records, a school teacher inciting unrest. Really, you've made this quite easy for us." Through an open door, Kate glimpsed a yard surrounded by high walls. Women moved there under armed guard loading boxes onto a wagon. Among them, Kate recognized faces from Edwin's ledger. Madeline, her lips swollen and one eye blackened, and a smaller figure in a faded calico dress, her wrists raw from rope, a Lakota girl with familiar beadwork at her throat. The girl lifted her eyes, scanning the building, and for a moment, her gaze locked with Dakota's. Hope and terror warred on her young face before a guard shoved her roughly toward the wagon. Ayanna. It had to be Ayanna. Marshal Hale's expression went flat and bureaucratic, and something in Kate's gut twisted. They had gambled everything on the Marshal being honest, and they had lost. "You're interfering with lawful contracts," Hale announced in a tone devoid of emotion. "Sheriff Doyle has vouched for Mr. Locke's character and business practices. The territory needs his copper for economic development. I won't allow outside agitators to disrupt legitimate commerce based on unsubstantiated accusations." But Kate, watching carefully, noticed something. The briefest hesitation when Hale took the ledger from Edwin's unresisting hands. The Marshal's sharp eyes scanned a page, not casually but with focus, as if memorizing entries before handing it to Lockhack. And that bureaucratic tone seemed almost rehearsed, like an actor delivering lines he'd practiced. The observation stuck in Kate's mind, something not quite fitting, but there was no time to examine it. Trusty Tom shoved them roughly toward the street exit. "You folks should leave Copper Canyon," Hale said flatly. "Go back where you came from. Stop interfering in things you don't understand." They were ejected to the dusty street with nothing. No ledger, no proof, no allies. Edwin's shoulders sagged. We have no evidence now, no documentation, no one to appeal to. Christian controls Bitter Creek Lock, controls Copper Canyon, and the marshal won't act. We failed. Then we get the ledger back, Dakota said grimly, scanning the buildings. And we get the women out. If we can't win through law, we win despite it. That night, under cover of darkness, they shadowed a supply convoy heading into the hills toward Steel Mountain Lock's primary mining operation, where the ore was richest and the conditions harshest. The mountain crouched under jagged peaks like a malevolent presence. Lanterns burning at the gate, armed patrols on catwalks. The whole place designed to keep workers in and trouble out. Under darkness, they crept toward the river ferry that serviced the mine. The plan was desperate. Dakota and Kate would slip among the wagons to reach the holding pens and free the women while Celine and Edwin cut the ferry ropes to prevent reinforcements from crossing quickly. But betrayal had traveled faster than hope. Slow Sam, a gambler from Bitter Creek, whose debts Franklin had forgiven in exchange for information, had told everything. The trap was set and waiting. As Dakota and Kate crawled under an ore wagon, boots crunched above them. Lantern light flared bright and blinding. Franklin's voice barked through the darkness. Lanterns up checked the riverbank. We got rats in the cargo. Gunfire erupted. Bullets tore through wagon planks, showering splinters. Dakota shoved Kate deeper under the axle, then rolled out firing. He tackled a guard, seized his rifle, used it to club another man, but a rifle butt cracked into his ribs with sickening force. Pain exploded white-hot, and he went to his knees, gasping. On the ferry dock, Edwin saw desperately at thick rope with his pocket knife. A shotgun boomed. Pellets rat his shoulder and back, and he collapsed with a cry. Celine dragged him behind crates, but Christian was already there, pistol whipping her down. Blood streamed from her temple as she crumpled. Franklin planted a boot on Dakota's ribs, grinding down. Dakota could feel broken bones grating together, agony radiating through his chest. Should have stayed on your own side of the river, Franklin snarled, face twisted with rage and satisfaction. Now you watch what happens to anyone who touches my property. Then we'll hang you nice and legal. Dakota slammed an elbow backward into Franklin's knee. The man cursed and stumbled, but a deputy's rifle barrel cracked across Dakota's skull. The world went black, spinning into unconsciousness. When Dakota woke, he was half submerged in river shallows, wrists bound with wet rope, head throbbing, ribs screaming. The ferry was pushing off with its cargo of wagons and prisoners. Through blurred vision, he saw Kate Celine, Edwin Moline, and Ayanna tied in a line like animals being led to slaughter. Christian Doyle leaned on the ferry railing, grinning down at him. You'll live to see the smoke from Steel Mountain. Watch your niece and your white woman disappear into the mines. Then we'll come back for you and charge you with murder. Found Slow Sam's body with your knife beside it. Evidence of assault on multiple lawmen. Attempted kidnapping. Nice and legal. Judge Thompson owes Locke money, so the trial will be real quick. You'll hang by week's end, and the Lakota will learn what happens when they interfere. Dakota watched the ferry disappear into morning mist, rage and helplessness choking him. He had failed. Failed Ayanna. Failed Kate. Failed everyone who had trusted him to make things right. At dawn, he was found by Bearclaw, an old prospector who lived in the hills and had no love for Locke or Christian. The grizzled man cut Dakota loose and dragged him onto dry ground, examining his injuries with practiced eyes. You look like hell, Long Shadow. Got 3-4 cracked ribs by the feel of it. Head wound's not too bad, but you're concussed. What did you do to make Locke's people so angry? They have my niece, Dakota rasped through split lips. And others, I have to reach them, have to get them out. Bearclaw studied him seriously. You'll die if you try climbing that mountain in your condition. Steel Mountain's got guards, walls, guns. You're one man injured with no weapons. Then I die. But I won't abandon them. I can't. Bearclaw sighed, pulling out a worn map from his pack and spreading it on a rock. There are ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels in Steel Mountain. The company never sealed them properly. Too expensive, and the managers didn't think anyone would be crazy enough to use them. If you go through the north shaft here, he pointed with a tobacco-stained finger, you can reach the processing area and holding pens without going through the main gate. But the shafts are narrow. If you get stuck, you'll die alone in the dark. If you fall, same result. And if they catch you inside, you'll wish you drowned in the river. Dakota studied the map, committing it to memory despite the pounding in his skull. Thank you, grandfather. If you get killed, I'll tell Tala it was your own damn fault for being stubborn. Steel Mountain sprawled across the hillside like a wounded animal. Smoke pouring from a dozen chimneys, the constant thunder of stamping mills shaking the ground. Dakota climbed to the north shaft, moving slowly despite the urgency. Every breath sent pain through his ribs. Twice he had to stop and vomit from the concussion, but he kept climbing. The ventilation shaft was barely wide enough for a man-rusted metal grating at the entrance. Dakota pried it loose and squeezed inside scraping skin from his shoulders and back. Inside, darkness was absolute, except for occasional cracks where lamplight filtered up from the mine below. The air smelled of sulfur copper, old sweat, and fear. He followed echoes, the rattle of wagon wheels, voices barking orders, and the scrape of shovels on rock. Water dripped steadily somewhere, a lonely sound in the darkness. His hands found handholds in rough stone, and he climbed down, descended deeper into the mountain's belly. A figure stepped from a side passage, and Dakota's hand went to his knife. The figure struck a match, and in the brief flare, Dakota recognized his brother's face. Gamda. Dakota froze. His brother stood there in clothes provided by the mine, a knife half drawn. His expression complicated anger, shame, defiance, something harder to name. So, you work for them now? Dakota asked quietly, not attacking but not relaxing either. Gam's jaw tightened. Locke promised food for the camp, bullets for hunting. He said if I worked for him, if I helped keep order, he'd speak to the soldiers about leaving our people alone for another season. What did your bridge building bring? Except trouble. Ayana is taken. You're hunted, and I'm trying to keep the rest of our people alive. The words cut because they held truth. Dakota had no easy answer, no high ground to claim. They keep their promises by chaining other people's daughters, he said finally. By stealing girls, Lakota and white both, and selling them like horses. You work for them. You're part of that chain. Help me break it. Then we can argue about whose path leads somewhere worth going. Silence stretched taut in the darkness. Dakota could hear his brother breathing, could feel the years of anger and disappointment and diverging choices between them. Gumda's hand remained on his knife hilt. Then slowly Guma relaxed and slid the blade back into its sheath. There's a side tunnel to the holding pens, he said quietly, not meeting Dakota's eyes. I was supposed to guard it tonight. I'll lead you there. But if you die doing this, I won't carry your bones home. You'll lie in a white man's mind, and I'll tell our mother you chose this. Fair enough, brother. They moved through darkness together. The first time in years they'd walked the same path. The tunnel opened onto a crude pen wooden planks and wire fencing, creating an enclosure where women huddled on bare ground. Kate stood near the fence rope around her waist, binding her to the group, her face pale, but her eyes hard as flint. Seeing Dakota emerge from shadows, her lips parted in shock. "You were supposed to stay alive," she whispered through the slat's voice, rough with emotion. "Working on it." Dakota answered, and despite everything, the pain, the danger, the likelihood they would all die here, he found himself smiling. While Gamda cut wire at the far end of the pen, Dakota palmed keys from a sleeping guard who smelled of whiskey and sweat. He passed them to Kate through the fence. She moved down the line with shaking hands, unlocking shackles, whispering urgent instructions. When she reached Ayanna, the girl clung to her, sobbing silently, and Kate held her for one precious moment before necessity drove them on. Outside, a whistle shrieked discovery. A guard had spotted the cut fence or noticed the missing keys. Voices shouted, boots pounded on wood. Gamda bolted for the hoist tower, racing up the ladder to gain high ground and better vantage. Dakota shoved his rifle into Kate's hands. "Lead them to the lower exit through that tunnel. When you hear 3 shots, run and don't look back. Don't wait for me. Just run." Kate wanted to argue, but there was no time. She nodded and turned to rally the women, her voice firm despite fear. "Stay close. Stay quiet. When I say run, and you don't stop. Understand?" Dakota positioned himself behind an ore cart as Locke's gunmen raced into the yard. Bullets pinged off iron. Splinters flew from wooden structures. Dakota fired with careful precision, counting shots, making each one mean something. From his perch high in the tower, Gamda picked off riflemen on the bluff with cold accuracy, each shot deliberate and deadly. But Gamda did more than just shoot. He spotted a water barrel suspended on chains above the main walkway used for firefighting with 2 carefully placed shots. He severed the chains. The barrel plummeted, smashing into the walkway below and flooding it, scattering guards and creating chaos. Then he shot through a support cable on the ore loading platform, collapsing one end and blocking the main approach to the holding pens. His tactical mind, honed by years of fighting for survival, turned the battlefield to their advantage. Kate hustled the women through the side tunnel, Edwin and Celine supporting those too weak to walk quickly. They passed a storage room stacked with crates and bundles of contracts and transfer documents. Kate hesitated, weighing speed against opportunity. Every instinct screamed to keep running. But without proof, they'd be fugitives forever hunted and unable to expose the system. "Grab what you can," she told Celine, stuffing papers into a canvas sack with shaking hands. "We need proof. We need evidence they can't explain away." Back in the yard, the battle intensified. Franklin emerged from behind a water tank shotgun, leveled his face. A mask of fury, he fired both barrels. Splinters exploded from Dakota's cover. One shard slicing his cheek, blood running hot down his jaw. Franklin reloaded with practice speed, the mechanical efficiency of a man who'd killed before. "You cost me everything," he screamed. "Ranch bride, reputation, future. I'll see you dead, even if I die doing it." Dakota rushed him as Franklin snapped the shotgun shut. They slammed together near an old vertical shaft, a maintenance tunnel that dropped hundreds of feet into darkness, its covering boards rotted and treacherous. The ancient wood creaked ominously under their combined weight as they grappled. Franklin drove a fist into Dakota's broken ribs, knowing exactly where to strike. And Dakota's vision went white with pain, but he answered with a vicious headbutt, feeling Franklin's nose crunch blood spraying hot across both their faces. Both men staggered boots, scraping dangerously close to the shaft's edge. Franklin grabbed Dakota's braids, jerking his head back, dragging him toward the void. The rotten boards groaned a sound like death itself. For one terrifying heartbeat, they teetered on the precipice, neither man willing to release the other. From the tunnel entrance, Kate appeared, canvas sack slung across her shoulder. Ayanna and the other women behind her. Seeing Dakota sliding towards certain death, she dropped the sack and sprinted to a nearby winch post, seizing the thick rope coiled there. Without hesitation, she flung the free end toward the struggling men. Dakota grabbed hold. Dakota's right hand shot out fingers, closing desperately around the rough hemp. He felt Kate's weight on the other end, heard her scream as the sudden tension nearly pulled her off her feet. Franklin, sensing his enemy's anchor, lunged forward with renewed fury, trying to tear Dakota away from his lifeline. The movement shifted Franklin's weight onto the weakest section of boarding. The wood splintered with a sharp crack that echoed across the yard. Franklin's eyes went wide, not with fear, but with pure, uncomprehending rage. His boots scrabbled for purchase on disintegrating planks. His free hand clawed at Dakota's arm fingers, digging into flesh with desperate strength. From above, Gamda saw what was happening. He raised his rifle, lined up the shot, but couldn't fire. The angle was wrong. Dakota too close, the risk too great. The rope jerked hard as Dakota's full weight came onto it. Kate screamed, boots sliding forward on loose gravel, unable to hold alone. Then Gamda was there, having descended from the tower at a dead run. He grabbed the rope above Kate's hands and threw his weight backward. Pulled together. They hauled hand over hand rope, burning through gloves and skin muscles, screaming in protest. But Dakota was heavier than Kate had anticipated, and Franklin still clung to him, adding impossible weight. The rope began to slip through their bleeding hands. Gamda made a split-second decision. "Hold him steady," he shouted to Kate. Then he released the rope, drew his knife in one fluid motion, and dove forward. He grabbed Franklin's wrist to the hand that clutched Dakota's arm and brought the knife down in a swift, brutal arc. Franklin screamed, his grip loosened just enough. Gamda shoved him backward with his shoulder, putting all his strength into it. The rest of the boarding gave way completely. Franklin Mororo fell into darkness, his scream echoing off stone walls, fading as he plummeted. The sound went on for terrible seconds, then ended with a distant final impact. No splash, no water at this shaft's bottom. Just stone and death. Dakota was hauled onto solid ground, rolling away from the shaft's edge, gasping. Kate collapsed beside him, hands bleeding, her entire body shaking. Gamda stood over them, both chest-heaving knife still in his hand, the blade clean. He'd struck clothing and glove, not flesh, but it had been enough. For a moment, the yard seemed suspended in time. The guards who had been advancing froze, staring at the collapsed shaft that had claimed Franklin. The women huddled near the tunnel entrance, waiting to see if they would live or die. Smoke from the stamping mills drifted across the scene like fog. Then Gamda moved with decisive authority. He raised his rifle and fired twice into the air, the shots sharp and commanding. "Your boss is dead," he shouted in English toward the scattered guards, then repeated it in Spanish for the Mexican workers. "Franklin Mororo is gone. You work for ghosts now. Drop your weapons or I drop you." The psychological impact was immediate. These were hired guns, not soldiers with loyalty to a cause. They fought for money, and with Franklin dead and the situation clearly deteriorating, survival instinct took over. One guard dropped his rifle, then another. Within moments, weapons clattered to the ground across the yard. Movement on the far side of the compound caught Kate's attention. Through the smoke and chaos, she spotted a figure slipping toward the back gate. Bartholomew Locke himself, limping but mobile. One hand pressed against his side, where blood seeped through expensive fabric. He was heading for a saddled horse, already calculating his escape. "Dakota!" she shouted, pointing. Dakota saw Locke mounting, preparing to flee with all his connections and resources that could rebuild the operation elsewhere, could corrupt new officials, and restart the nightmare in a different territory. For one agonizing second, he looked between the group of women still emerging from the tunnel. some stumbling, needing help, vulnerable to any remaining threat, and Locke, disappearing with the means to ensure this evil would never truly end. The choice tore at him. Every instinct as a warrior screamed to pursue the enemy leader, to finish what they'd started, to ensure justice was complete. But Kate was looking at him, and behind her were Ayanna Maline and 30 other women who needed protection right now, not later. And something fundamental had shifted in him over these terrible, transformative days. Something about what truly mattered, about the difference between winning battles and building something worth fighting for, about choosing to protect rather than simply destroy. Let him go, Dakota decided, turning away from the fleeing figure. Get the women to safety first. We have the documents. Without Franklin, without Christian, without this place, he's just a man running. And Bearclaw spread the word. Every prospector, every honest miner, every person Locke ever cheated. Tell them he's heading toward Copper Canyon. Tell them he's alone. Gamba understood immediately. A slow, grim smile crossed his face. The territory is a dangerous place. Accidents happen, especially to men riding alone through country where they've made enemies. Within an hour, as the freed women were being organized and the captured guards secured riders, began leaving Steel Mountain in small groups. Miners who had witnessed the battle, prospectors who had heard the story, men who had lost wives or daughters to Locke's operation, or who simply believed in frontier justice. They rode in different directions, cutting off escape routes, spreading word through the hills. Locke would find no sanctuary, no place to hide, no one willing to help him. The territory itself would become his prison, and then his grave. The immediate battle over Steel Mountain became a temporary holding area as the scope of what they'd found became clear. Women emerged, blinking into daylight, more than 30 in total, ranging from teenagers to women in their 40s. Lakota and white and Mexican and Chinese and Irish, all bound by the common experience of being treated as merchandise, of being sold and traded and worked until they broke. Bearclaw arrived with a dozen men he'd rallied from surrounding claims miners and prospectors who had no love for Locke's operation, who resented his monopolistic control and brutal methods. They helped disarm the surrendered guards, binding them for transport to face justice. The old prospector clasped Dakota's shoulder, his weathered face showing approval. You did good, Long Shadow. Crazy as hell, but good. Meanwhile, Celine and Kate stripped the administration office of everything useful, ledgers detailing every transaction. Contracts showing the sham marriages and calculated debts. Telegraph copies that proved coordination between Locke, Christian, and corrupt officials across 3 territories. Payroll records showing bribes and payments that would implicate dozens of men in positions of power. Dr. Edwin Pale, from blood loss, but functioning on pure determination, pointed out which papers proved which crimes. His methodical mind cataloged evidence with the same precision he brought to medical diagnosis. As they worked, Edwin found something that made him pause, holding up a telegram to the light. Look at this, he said, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and dawning comprehension. Sent from this office to Marshal Hale 3 weeks ago, detailing exactly what Locke was doing: trafficking, forced labor, fraudulent marriages, the whole operation. And here's Hale's response. Celine leaned over his shoulder, reading the coded language. He's not dismissing it. He's telling Loach he needs more evidence before he can act officially, asking Loach to continue operations normally so the full extent can be documented. Marshal Hale was building a case, Edwin said slowly, understanding crystallizing. He was documenting everything, gathering evidence, but he needed Lockett to believe he was safe to keep operating openly so the entire network would be exposed. Kate remembered that brief hesitation when Hale had taken the ledger from Edwin, the way his sharp eyes had scanned a page with intense focus before handing it to Locke. Not casual dismissal, but deliberate memorization. His flat, bureaucratic tone that had seemed so crushingly final now appeared in a different light, like an actor playing a necessary role. "He let us walk out because he knew we'd keep pushing," she said. "He needed someone outside the official system to force everything into the open, where he could act without appearing to overstep his authority or tip his hand too early." Dakota, nursing his cracked ribs nearby, while Gamda helped Ayana onto a horse, shook his head with grudging respect. A dangerous game the Marshal played. If we'd failed, if Locke had killed all of us, he would have lost his witnesses and much of his evidence. Everything would have been buried. "But we didn't fail," Celine said firmly, her voice stronger now, despite the dried blood in her hair from Christian's blow. "We're standing here. The women are free, and we have enough evidence to bury everyone who worked with him." They loaded the most damning documents into wagons. Wounded guards and foremen were bound for transport to face charges. Gamda helped organize the exodus, his natural leadership emerging now that it was channeled toward protection rather than anger. He placed the weakest women in wagons, assigned the stronger ones. Horses created a defensive formation that could respond to threats from any direction. When Ayana clung to him, something in his hard expression finally truly softened. "You chose our people today," Dakota told him quietly as they stood together watching the preparations. "You chose right." Gam shrugged, still not quite meeting his eyes, but his voice when he spoke was less hostile than it had been in years. "You made it hard to do otherwise. You're annoyingly persistent, brother. Not forgiveness, not yet." The wounds between them were too deep for instant healing, but no longer the knife edge of hostility that had existed, no longer the certainty that their paths could never converge. It was a beginning, fragile but real. They traveled back as a grim caravan, Lakota riders forming an outer perimeter, freed women in the protected center, sympathetic miners who had witnessed the battle and been shocked into action. The journey took 3 days, moving slowly to accommodate the injured and traumatized. At night they made camp, and the women began to tell their stories to each other, finding strength in shared experience, beginning the long process of reclaiming their voices. At a junction station halfway to Bitter Creek, Celine sent a telegram to Captain Thomas Barrow, an Army officer she had tutored years ago. Her message was plain and urgent. "Trafficking ring exposed. Stop corrupt sheriff. Stop women held in slavery. Stop evidence available. Stop. Need immediate assistance. Stop Morrow." The response came within 2 hours, already en route with Marshal Hale. "Stop. Hold position. Stop justice coming. Stop Barrow." "Hale must have sent word as soon as we left Copper Canyon," Edwin said, studying the telegram. "He knew we'd force everything into the open and knew the confrontation at Steel Mountain would draw out Locke's full operation and create the crisis that would justify federal intervention." When they crested the last rise above Bitter Creek 3 days later, blue-coated cavalry soldiers were already there. Marshal Vernon Hale stood conferring with Captain Barrow outside the church where everything had begun. In the same church where Franklin had struck, Kate and Dakota had walked through the doors like righteousness made flesh. A makeshift court convened on the church steps, the symbolism deliberate. Marshal Hale, no longer wearing his bureaucratic mask, stood with military bearing and addressed the gathered crowd. But first he turned to Kate, Dakota, Celine, and Edwin, speaking directly to them. "I apologize for the deception." Hale said, his voice carrying authority, but also genuine regret. "For 3 months, I've been building a case against this trafficking ring. But Bartholomew Locke had connections throughout the territorial government judges. He'd bribed officials. He'd blackmailed other sheriffs partnered in similar operations. If I had arrested him on suspicion alone, A good lawyer would have gotten him released on technicalities, and the whole network would have scattered. I needed him to operate openly, to document his crime so thoroughly that no lawyer and no corrupt judge could explain them away. "You gambled with our lives," Celine said sharply, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "I did," Hale acknowledged without flinching. "And I won't insult you by claiming it was easy or that I'm comfortable with it. But taking down Locke alone wouldn't have broken the network. I needed the whole system exposed. When you arrived with that ledger, I saw people motivated by personal stakes, people who wouldn't stop. I memorized key entries before giving it back to Locke, enough to corroborate what you'd bring back if you survived. What you did at Steel Mountain forced everything into the open, where I could act with full authority. Because of your documents and witnesses, we've already begun arrests in 3 territories. 16 officials charged, including 2 judges and 4 sheriffs. This isn't just about Bitter Creek anymore. The ledgers and contracts were displayed on tables. Marshal Hale read charges against Sheriff Christian Doyle, currently shackled kidnapping fraud, assault conspiracy, false imprisonment, slave trading violation of federal laws against kidnapping and slave trading corruption of public office. The list went on. Witnesses came forward. Meline stood straight despite her bruises, identifying the contract that spelled out Kate's fate. This document plans to sell Catherine Celine. She said her finger pointing one bride, healthy age 23, payment of $75 upon delivery. Anna Schmidt believed dead of fever, told of being drugged and transferred. Lucia Mendez told of being married and sold within 2 weeks. One by one, 32 women testified. Their voices shook at first, then grew stronger with each story. The crowd that had watched Franklin strike Kate without protest now listened in growing shame. Christian tried to bluff. "You'll trust these women over your own sheriff." Marshal Hale's voice could have cut steel. "I trust your signature. I trust the detailed ledgers showing you accepted over $3,000 from Log. I trust the testimony of 32 women whose stories corroborate the documents. That's more than enough to hang you." Christian was led away in shackles, shouting threats that rang hollow. The same townsfolk who had stayed silent now claimed they'd always suspected something wrong. Kate watched with contempt and pity, understanding that courage often came only after danger passed. Over the following weeks, the kidnapping ring cracked open across the territory. Documents from Steel Mountain led to arrests in Denver, Salt Lake City, Wyoming towns, mining camps throughout Montana. The scandal reached newspapers as far as San Francisco and Chicago. Some freed women returned east under Army escort, provided with tickets and money from Locke-seized assets. Others claimed wages and land plots from seized properties. Bitter Creek changed. The old freight office became a school where Celine taught alongside Winona and Macaulay, teaching children in English and Lakota. Franklin's ranch transformed under Meline's management, hiring other women, becoming a place where no one asked about your past. Dr. Edwin's clinic expanded with Army support, treating everyone regardless of race. One evening, Captain Barrow rode to the Lakota camp with papers. He sat by the river with Dakota, Kate, Edwin, and Celine. "The territorial lawyers found something interesting," Barrow said, handing Kate a document. "Reverend Colt never filed proper church registration. Every ceremony he conducted was legally invalid." Kate read it twice, feeling something lift from her chest. "So I was never married to Franklin. Not legally." "Never," Barrow confirmed. He handed her another document. "And this is the original agreement between Locke and Franklin. After a trial month, you were to be transferred for $75. The paper quantified her worth like livestock. Any lingering guilt about Franklin's death died cleanly." She folded the documents carefully. "What happens now? What do we do now that we're not running or fighting? That depends on what you want." Barrow said, "You're free. Actually, Truly free. What do you want to be? Kate looked up river toward Lakota land, then back toward town. She thought of Malene, Selena, Ayana, all building futures. I want to stand where I can do the most good, help other women who come here looking for something better, and I don't intend to stand alone if someone is stubborn enough to stand with me. Dakota's mouth quirked in a rare smile. I know someone exactly like that, though I warn you, he's been told he's difficult and argumentative. Good, Kate said, meeting his eyes. I've had enough of men who are easy to manage. I want someone who challenges me. Weeks later, as summer shifted toward autumn, Kate saddled a mare. Dakota mounted beside her, and they rode the river trail together, checking boundary markers, talking with farmers, stopping at camps, where girls practiced letters instead of fearing wagons. They had become advocates, mediators, people who stood between the vulnerable and those who would exploit them. It wasn't official, wasn't always paid, but it mattered. One afternoon, checking a property dispute at an old mine entrance, they found themselves alone in cool shadows. Kate became acutely aware of how close Dakota stood. When I thought you were dead, Kate said quietly. When the ferry pulled away and I saw you in the shallows, I realized something. I've known you less than 2 months, but losing you would have felt like losing a part of myself I'd only just discovered. Dakota was silent for a moment. Then, when Franklin grabbed you at the altar, something shifted. I told myself I was acting for justice. But the truth is, I couldn't stand to see you hurt. Not you, specifically not Kate. It was personal. She turned to face him. His dark eyes held hers steadily. Vulnerability offered like a gift. The world expects me to be grateful, Kate said, the rescued bride thanking her savior. But what I feel is nothing like gratitude. It's... She didn't finish because Dakota stepped closer, his hand cupping her cheek. Kate's breath caught. May I? He asked quietly. Instead of answering, Kate closed the distance. The kiss was gentle at first, then deeper, more certain, conveying emotion without impropri. When they drew apart, both were breathing unevenly. The white folks in town will have opinions, Dakota said about a white woman and a Lakota man. Let them, Kate replied with certainty. I didn't cross an ocean and nearly die to live by their narrow rules. I found freedom in choosing my own path, in standing beside someone who sees me as equal. They stood there, foreheads touching, before duty called them back. At one windy bend, days later, dust kicked up. Dakota nudged his horse ahead, shielding Kate. When it settled, Kate reached across and straightened the beaded band on his sleeve. New work from Winona, intricate patterns telling stories. Her fingers lingered and Dakota met her eyes. The mask slipped, and she saw the man beneath, scarred, tired, but no longer alone. Behind them lay a church where a slap had echoed until a warrior said 3 words, "Touch her again." Those words had shattered illusion and begun unraveling evil. Ahead lay country, where contracts, not fists, would decide futures, where children learned together, where men like Christian and Franklin would find no purchase, where law would protect the vulnerable more often than predators. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. At the Lakota camp that evening, they found Tala teaching Ayana beadwork. The girl's hands steady, the haunted look fading. "Aunt Kate," Ayana called, "come see." Kate knelt, examining intricate work. "It's remarkable, Ayana." The girl looked up, eyes serious beyond her ears. "You saved me. You and Uncle Dakota and Uncle Gamda. When I'm old, I'll tell my grandchildren about the woman from across the ocean who helped break the chains." Kate's throat tightened. She cupped the girl's face. "You would have saved yourself eventually. You're stronger than you know. But I'm glad I was there." As the sun set, painting the sky impossible colors, Kate stood by the river with Dakota, watching water flow endlessly. They stood close shoulders, touching comfortable in silence. "Do you regret it?" Dakota asked. "Coming all this way, believing lies, nearly dying." Kate considered seriously. She had lost the future she'd imagined. Safe marriage, quiet life, predictable days. That future had been built on illusions. What she found was harder, more dangerous, more uncertain. But it was real, earned through courage she hadn't known she possessed. "No," she said with certainty. "If I hadn't come, those ledgers wouldn't have been found. Malene and the others would still be trapped. Ayana might be lost forever, and I wouldn't be standing here free to choose my path beside someone who sees me as a partner. I came looking for safety, but I found something better. I found myself." Dakota nodded slowly. "Sometimes the wrong path leads where you needed to be." Kate laughed. "Did the Lakota really say that, or did you just make it up?" His smile broadened. "Does it matter if it's true?" Kate laughed again and leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling his warmth, the steadiness that had become her anchor around them. The camp settled into evening routines. Fires lit food, shared stories told children playing. Ordinary and beautiful in its ordinariness. Proof that survival was possible and healing was real. She had come to Bitter Creek, a bride with no choices, bound by contracts, sold to a man who saw her as merchandise. She left that identity behind in a church where a slap echoed and a warrior stepped forward. Now she was simply Kate, standing on the frontier's edge with a rifle at her hip, evidence of evil defeated in her pocket, and a future she would write with her own hands. She was a woman who had learned to shoot and fight, who had helped break chains, who had stood up when society told her to kneel. And she was not alone. Beside her stood Dakota. Behind her stood Celine and Malene and Ayana and all the others who had survived. Ahead lay challenges and injustices still to fight, because one victory never solved everything. But they had proven change was possible, that evil could be exposed and defeated, that ordinary people standing together could triumph. For tonight, standing by the river, as stars emerged like promises being kept, Kate allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt since her father died. Hope. Real hope, not the desperate kind, but the genuine article built on evidence and community and her own proven strength. Built on knowing she had looked evil in the face and refused to surrender. She had survived. They all had. And that was worth something. That was worth everything.